Some of the most memorable events in our history books took place during the Stuart period. The Great Fire of London, the Great Plague, the Civil War, and one of the most famous assassination attempts of all time, the Gunpowder Plot. Guy Fawkes and his mob tried to blow up King James I and the Houses of Parliament with 36 barrels of gunpowder. But he was foiled by a tip-off and executed. So what's the connection with a milk float? Well, my first worst job is the Saltpeter Man, and his task was to collect the basic ingredient for gunpowder, which was saltpeter. And in the 17th century, the most common way of getting saltpeter was by processing urine, lots of it. So in 1625, in London, they established this crazy kind of milk run. But instead of leaving milk on people's doorsteps, they went from door to door collecting urine that people had left out for them. Back then, they would have had a horse and cart with a barrel on the back. They did their rounds every other day in the winter and every day in the summer, when it was a hot, hard slog, not to mention sticky and smelly. Urine can be processed to produce potassium nitrate, saltpeter. And every drop was crucial, because the Gunpowder Plot kicked off a whole century of violence. It was the Saltpeter Man who fueled every musket and cannon. But the insatiable demand was so high that most of his work was much harder. Britain's leading expert on the job took me trudging through the cold to a happy but smelly hunting ground for a Saltpeter Man. Why did they bother coming out to the country with their barrows? Why didn't they just use the urine they got in the towns?
Well, what they needed was the much higher levels of nitrates that you get when it's all rotted down into manure like this.
How would they know where to look for it? It wasn't just dung heaps, was it?
Well, dung heaps was a really good place, but actually anywhere where you've got faeces, urine, basically.
So outside people's houses?
Oh, and inside. In fact, they dug absolutely everywhere.
But if you came to my house looking for dung, I'd tell you to push off.
Oh, well, you could try that, of course, but the commissioners had the right, rather like the VAT man today, to dig absolutely anywhere. And they were accused of digging in people's chambers, in bedrooms, even in the house of God. They then had the right not only to enter your house, but to demand that you supply the carts and the horses at a reduced rate, of course.
You're kidding.
No, and of course they were deeply hated for that too.
So not only were you breaking your back shoveling manure all day, but people hated you for invading their privacy. Contemporary reports indicate that although they were state-sanctioned, Saltpeter men were often bully boys who had no qualms about bursting into people's homes. Who are the blokes who did this work?
Oh, they were a real rabble of real nasty people, and probably a lovely reference to Rough Ralph and Welsh Will, who are two of the people, but they're often referred to in the papers and statements as the rabble.
So did they make much money out of this?
Well, the people who did the shovelling didn't, of course, because they were on the bottom of the heap. But you can get some idea of how much money was in this when the guys that employed, the rabble as it were paying something like £1,700 for the privilege of being able to go and get the saltpeter.
So you've got the guys at the bottom shoveling and the guys at the top making millions and millions of pounds.
Yeah, exactly, isn't it? Things don't change today, do they, at all? No.
If that wasn't bad enough, you still had to get the nitrate crystals out of the muck by swilling it through with water and boiling it up, making an even worse stench. I do. Once purified, saltpeter needs to be combined with two other chemicals to make the black powder that Guy Fawkes was after.
Here we are.
This is white stuff,
yeah.
Purified, yeah.
We need sulphur and we need charcoal.
What sort of proportions?
Now, the normal mix we make up is 75% saltpeter, 10% sulphur and 15% charcoal.
So how much gunpowder was that much dung make?
Not an awful lot. Roughly about maybe this much.
One spadeful makes a rather disappointing fizzle. Gunpowder needs to be compacted before it'll explode. We did make an official request, but unfortunately the government politely declined, so we're not going to be able to blow up even the smallest part of the Houses of Parliament. But I don't want to disappoint you. There is going to be an explosion. Underneath this car is 3 kilograms of powder, which is roughly 1/500th of the amount that Guy Fawkes used. So to demonstrate the efficacy of even a relatively small amount of gunpowder, here we are, just to make sure I'm not completely deafened by the blast. 2, 1... Look at that! God, it's amazing, that hole.
It really has actually just punched it through, hasn't it?
Yeah, you wouldn't get much for that in the second-hand car market.
Certainly not now.
It's like a giant has just gone poof.
Yeah?
What it would have been like 500 times that much amount of explosives inside the House of Commons.
In the sort of bottom of the building, you know, the base of the building that it was in, it would have just taken the top of the building off and just blown it to smithereens.
How much dung would we need to get rid of the House of Commons?
Something like between 50 and 75 tonnes of it.
So in Saltpeter Man terms, that means that Rough Ralph and Co. would have had to shift 1,500 wheels